He was the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, elect of God. The 225th Emperor of a dynasty that stretched back 3,000 years to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. A man revered as a living god by Rastafarians across the world. A global icon who stood for African independence on the world stage. And this is how his reign ended. On September 12, 1974, the King of Kings was unceremoniously bundled into a common car. Driven from his palace through streets filled with scornful crowds, and erased from power. The ancient Solomonic dynasty was extinguished not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a car door. How did it come to this? How did a figure of such immense historical and spiritual weight, a leader who brought his nation into the modern world, lose it all? This is the story of the great paradox of Haile Selassie, the global statesman who lost touch with his own people, and the modernizer whose refusal to change led to his own destruction. To understand the fall, we must first understand the rise. Born Tafari Makanan in 1892, the future emperor entered a world where his homeland, Ethiopia, was a defiant anomaly. As European powers carved up the continent in the scramble for Africa, Ethiopia stood alone, having delivered a stunning defeat to Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. It was a beacon of black independence in a colonized world. Tafari was intelligent, ambitious, and a master of court politics. After a power struggle, he became regent in 1916, and finally in 1930 was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie. He immediately embarked on a mission to centralize power and modernize a deeply feudal state. He introduced Ethiopia's first written constitution, formally abolished slavery, and expanded education, seeking to build a loyal, skilled elite to run his new Ethiopia. But his greatest test came in 1935. Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy, seeking revenge for the humiliation of Adwa, invaded. The Ethiopian army, brave but outmatched by tanks and chemical weapons, was defeated. Selassie was forced into a 5-year exile. It was on the world stage that he became a legend. In a moving address to the League of Nations in 1936, he warned the world of the consequences of inaction. The League failed to act, but his words resonated across the globe, transforming him into a living symbol of resistance against fascism. He returned triumphantly in 1941 with the help of Allied forces, his international stature higher than ever. In the post-war world, Selassie expertly navigated the new geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. Ethiopia became a key American ally in the Horn of Africa. In exchange for aid and military support, the United States gained access to the vital Kagnu Station, a massive communications and spy base in the territory of Eritrea, which the UN had federated with Ethiopia in 1952. This alliance propped up Selassie's regime, making him a cornerstone of American strategy in the region. His crowning achievement was positioning himself as the elder statesman of a newly independent continent. In 1963, he hosted the summit that created the Organization of African Unity, or OAU, in his capital, Addis Ababa. He became its first chairman, the father figure of Pan-Africanism. And then there was the phenomenon he had no control over, but which sealed his global image: Rastafarianism. In Jamaica, a new religion had emerged that saw this distant African king as their Messiah, the second coming of Christ. To millions, he was not just a king, but a god. But in a tragic irony, the more his star rose internationally, the more disconnected he became from the realities at home. He was a steadfast advocate for African unity, even as the unity of his own empire was beginning to crack. Some critics would later use a bitter metaphor. Haile Selassie was a wayward husband, cheating on his country for the thrill of an international mistress. The changes the emperor himself had set in motion were now turning against him. The first and most potent seed of rebellion was planted in the minds of the young. Selassie had established Haile Selassie University, hoping to create a loyal generation of administrators. He was confident they would prioritize good jobs over politics. He was wrong. Exposed to global political currents, the university became a breeding ground for revolutionary thought. Students devoured the works of Marx and Lenin. To this new generation, the emperor was not a symbol of independence, but a feudal autocrat, a bourgeois bureaucrat backed by American imperialists. The student union newspaper, which Selassie reluctantly permitted, began publishing thinly veiled critiques. By the late 1960s, these critiques became open rebellions, leading to violent clashes with police and the tragic deaths of student protesters. The very youth he sought to uplift now saw him as the enemy. At the same time, a fire was raging on his northern border. In 1962, Selassie made a fateful decision. He unilaterally dissolved the federation with Eritrea and annexed it as a province. This act of imperial arrogance ignited a fierce war for independence, led by the Eritrean Liberation Front, the ELF. For decades, this brutal conflict would drain Ethiopia's treasury, lead its army, and serve as a constant, violent reminder of the emperor's autocratic nature. In 1972, a devastating drought struck the northern province of Wallo. The harvest failed. Livestock died in droves. A horrific famine began to sweep the land. The imperial government's response was not just slow, it was criminal. Fearing it would tarnish the nation's image and hurt tourism, officials actively covered up the extent of the crisis. While tens of thousands starved, life in the capital continued. In a moment of catastrophic misjudgment, the regime spent an estimated $35 million, an astronomical sum at the time, on a lavish celebration for the emperor's 80th birthday. The truth was eventually exposed to the world by a courageous British journalist, Jonathan Dimbleby, in a documentary titled The Unknown Famine. The footage was horrifying. It showed skeletal children and a population on the brink of death, and it was intercut with scenes of the emperor feeding his pet dogs choice cuts of meat from a silver platter at his palace. The impact was seismic. For the Ethiopian urban elite, the students, and the military, the image was unforgivable. The divine king was not just out of touch, he was callously indifferent. The famine would ultimately claim between 50,000 and 100,000 lives, and it shattered the last vestiges of the emperor's moral authority. By 1974, the empire was a powder keg. The global oil crisis sent fuel prices skyrocketing, leading to crippling strikes by taxi drivers. Then, the institution that had been the bedrock of his power, the military, began to crumble. It started small. In a remote outpost in Negel, enlisted men mutinied over poor food and a lack of clean water. When the emperor gave in to their demands, the message spread like wildfire to every barracks in the nation. Insubordination would be rewarded. Soon, units across the country were mutinying, demanding higher pay and the dismissal of corrupt officers. Selassie, the commander-in-chief, had lost control of his own army. Out of this chaos, a shadowy group emerged. It was a coordinating committee of low-ranking officers and enlisted men from across the armed forces. They called themselves the Derg, which simply means committee in Amharic. For months, they operated from the shadows, their membership a secret. They were organized, patient, and ruthless. From February to September 1974, the Derg executed what historians call a creeping coup. They didn't seize power in one dramatic assault. Instead, they slowly and methodically sliced away the pillars of the imperial regime. One by one, they called on the emperor's most powerful allies, princes, generals, ministers, to surrender. Terrified, most of them did, and were imprisoned in the basement of the Grand Palace. The Derg also unleashed a powerful propaganda campaign. State media, now under their control, ran stories of corruption and greed. They rebroadcast Dimbleby's famine documentary, endlessly showing the emperor feeding his dogs. The mystique of the monarchy was being systematically destroyed. Inside the Derg, a little-known major with a reputation for brutality was consolidating his power. His name was Mengistu Haile Mariam. He was a man of terrifying ambition, who would soon hijack the revolution for his own bloody purposes. By early September 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie was a prisoner in his own palace, a lonely, isolated old man. The Derg had stripped him of his friends, his government, and his authority. All that was left was the title. On September 11th, his daughter and granddaughters were arrested, their heads shaved, and thrown into a common dungeon. The next day, Derg officers arrived at the Jubilee Palace. After a brief confrontation over his alleged hidden fortune, they read him a proclamation. His reign was over. There was no glorious last stand, no final, defiant speech. The King of Kings, the symbol of a 3,000-year-old empire, was driven away to his place of detention. As the car passed, the crowds that once cheered him now jeered, celebrating the end of an era. The Derg declared an end to the monarchy in March 1975. Hopes for a democratic transition were brutally crushed, as Mengistu Haile Mariam solidified his grip on power, unleashing a period of state-sponsored mass murder. Ethiopia swapped a feudal monarchy for a dictatorship that would prove far more violent. And Haile Selassie. He died in captivity in August 1975, a year after his overthrow. The official cause was circulatory failure, but the truth is far darker. It is widely believed that Mengistu ordered his murder and that the emperor was smothered with a pillow in his bed. In an act of ultimate desecration, his body was secretly buried beneath a latrine in the palace, a spot over which Mengistu would later build his personal office. The legacy of Haile Selassie is one of profound and painful contradictions. He was a visionary modernizer who became a prisoner of his own past, a symbol of African freedom who ruled as an autocrat, figure of international acclaim who failed to see the suffering of his own people, a man worshipped as a god who died a lonely, undignified death at the hands of his own soldiers. His fall was the result of a perfect storm, a new generation that rejected his authority. A draining colonial war, a catastrophic famine that exposed his regime's moral bankruptcy, and a military that finally broke its loyalty. He failed to realize that the world he had helped create, one of nation-states, modern education, and global politics, had no room for an absolute monarch who believed he was chosen by God. The story of Haile Selassie is a timeless lesson in the nature of power. It shows how even the most towering figures, the most ancient institutions, and the most potent symbols can be swept away. When they lose touch with the people, they rule and refuse to bend to the inevitable winds of change. And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.